everyone. As you can probably tell or not tell by my garb, I am 1800s minion Michelle, and today for this, what I would have done Thursday, I thought it would be interesting to dive into one of the most overly bizarre horror films that has come out relatively recently within this 21st century era, which I am not a part of, but nonetheless, I thought it would be one that is worthy and interesting of exploring. So without further ado, let me address The Wicker Man, starring none other than the famous, supposedly Nicolas Cage of your time. So this movie is rather bizarre, uh, like I've mentioned before, and it's also really uh, hard to follow at times exactly what they're trying to ultimately get across with the film. You are on the one hand tossed a bunch of different uh, images and different scenarios sort of end up occurring, and by the end of the film you are just thinking to yourself, what in the world were they thinking? And I think largely this comes as a result of the plot, as well as the character relationships as well. And thought it would be interesting to kind of express what I would have done had I been the director of this film, and had I been in an era of filmmaking as opposed to what largely 1800s people know of as the stage. So basically, the entire plot summary of this movie can be summarized in this supposed paragraph that I'm about to say. The main character, Nicolas Cage, and I'm just going to say Nicolas Cage because he's playing Nicolas Cage in this movie, uh, ends up going to an island inhabited by a cult and its members, because he believes that his supposed daughter is missing, and he is told by the supposed mother of the daughter, well, technically she's supposed to be, I guess, that that she is missing, and it's not really thoroughly explained if Nicolas Cage actually is the father. It's a rather complicated scenario. I don't understand why they can't just have it simple and direct. But I think right out of the gate, had they decided to alter the whole scenario, and I think actually going with a 19, maybe even 50s era would, I think, have suited this film better than in modern times. Um, Only because of our sort of limited capacity um, as far as, I guess, communication is concerned. And also because I think it would add an interesting layer to what the film ultimately is sort of trying to get across. So basically, not only would I have changed the era, I would have also altered the way in which Nicolas Cage goes about his supposed mission. What I would have done is I really wouldn't have had him have any specific connection to the child. I think it should have just been a strict case in that he goes to this village who asks him for help because they want to find the missing child. And so he goes to this very secluded village. You know, there's nothing for miles and miles on end. And he ultimately discovers that there's all women there. I wouldn't have inserted men like this film did. I think that really deters from its real approach, and I think would have made a better setup to the plot. So I would have had Nicolas Cage arrive to the village slash cult of these women, and ultimately ends up getting to know the sort of bizarre and strange surroundings. And they could have done a variety of scenarios to make it rather strange and make him feel a little uncomfortable and uneased. And it's interesting because what they could have done with this plot, instead of basically the way in which the plot's executed within the film, he largely just kind of just ends up ultimately discovering that he has to be the sacrifice. And it's not really given a whole lot of clarity as far as the clues. And there's no really and build up into finding the supposed missing child. So basically what I would have done is I would have made it so that this cult tries to create an elaborate scheme to sort of mess with Nicolas Cage's mind, and also kind of at the same time throw these clues at him to make him think that he's getting much closer into finding the child. So basically it's, and I also would have made the cult a little bit more, I guess you could say, witchcraft oriented. I mean, this is supposed to be a film about largely the female demographic being the bad guys. So if you want to do that, I think considering the scenario and the really strange nature to it, I mean, inserting witches would have been, I think, a wonderful idea. And, you know, you could have played around with the whole concept if they're actually, you know, capable of doing certain evil things, or if it's kind of in Nicolas Cage's mind that they're doing certain things, you know, and they can play tons of tricks on him and all of that stuff, because that's kind of what witches as characters kind of do. They mess with people. You know, they play tricks on them. They try to, you know, kind of seduce their victims, so to speak, at points as well. It's not like they come right out of the woodworks and, you know, capture you. They mess with your mind and then ultimately put you in a weak position, and then you end up sort of succumbing to their scheme. And that's how I ultimately would have revealed everything, is just have them play around with him, and then ultimately once he realizes what ultimately their plan is, you know, it makes it all that more, I think, intriguing. And also I think the whole idea of them sacrificing him just for crops, I think, is ultimately a stupid decision. I think what they could have done is, and largely it's sort of emphasized within this film, that the females don't particularly care for the male characters. It's almost like the film is trying to show how evil men are, which, again, the way they approach this is completely, I think, deplorable from the male, for the male gender in particular, more so than the female one. I mean, even though the females are the evil ones in this film, you know, they still hold all the power, and they still end up winning at the end, you know. So I really don't see why this is supposed to really be so offensive to women, when it kind of makes them the ultimate victory, or gives them the ultimate victory, so to speak. And you know, basically puts the label of men are pigs and blah blah blah, and you'll see that within the film, that's fairly, that's a primary example of the kinds of really sort of messed up way into which it sort of addresses the whole gender politics. But at the same time, what they could have done is they could have had these women be brainwashed. They could have had some kind of a leader, and the brainwashing would be that basically all men are evil. They're all out to get you. They want to destroy you and your potential and blah, 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 blah. And so they created this society where they wouldn't be surrounded by men at all. And they would just live there. And basically, what they would do in order to get kids is to kind of, they would kind of just bring in kids, maybe even from the outside, or they would find women who um, I guess, maybe abandoned somehow, or maybe a man treated them bad in their life, and they take them in and they sort of convert them into the cult of teaching them that men are evil and they're the enemy. And so that's why Nicolas Cage ultimately ends up being the sacrifice, not because of just some stupid harvest, but because he is of the male gender. And you could bring up some whole kind of scenario how they're ridding him away because he's an evil spirit or something. You could have gone into this whole deeply thought out explanation as to why these women think the way they do and why they're basically all pretty crazy, and how they kind of just feed off of people who are who are uh, who are weak. And what I think would have suited itself well is if they had actually had some dimension within the cult. Within the film, there's largely, primarily, all the females just they kind of look down on the men, and they kind of they really don't give really straight answers to Nicolas Cage. They don't, they're, and even Nicolas Cage character is also fairly unlikable for the most part. So it's kind of like it's designed to make it look like the female gender is somehow better, I guess, because he's supposedly a jerk. So I think I definitely would have altered his character to be a lot more sympathetic, although there might have been points within this film where they try to do that, but it doesn't really go too much anywhere. So that needed to definitely be altered as well. But I think had they really focused on this cult, had they really tried to insert a whole kind of new world and culture that these women inhabit, and would kind of explain a little bit why they end up going into this kind of a cult. And maybe they could even allude to the whole history behind, witches, and behind sort of the persecution that was happening, and how that kind of got the ball rolling into them thinking that the people that were largely in authority, in particular men, were sort of the enemy, so to speak. So again, you could have done it in that sense and built up that whole environment, and it would have ultimately explained why they would want to lure a man to them, because they see them as somehow a curse, so to speak, somehow. Um, I think that would have suited itself a lot better than just having some very thrown in explanation of a harvest. I mean, that's just kind of dumb, in my honest and humble opinion. So, had they done that, that would have suited itself well. And if they, put in some more dimensions with the women within the cult, like if some of the women in the cult were actually sympathetic to Nicolas Cage's character, and maybe actually want to try to break free from the cult as well, but they're maybe afraid that they'll be considered the enemy or something, and that Nicolas Cage and maybe some of the women sort of work together and try to figure out a way out of the cult. that I think would have worked a whole lot better as well. Um, and you know, you could really play around with the idea if they actually do have some kind of powers, and if they do have, if there is something supernatural about this whole cult, that actually sort of exists within the realm of the film. That would have been, I think, really interesting. But they didn't really do that. I mean, it's just hinted at, but it's not really explored all that much, and it really falls flat. So I think, you know, had they made his character more sympathetic, and have him not be related into and have anything really to do with the cult at all, not giving him a supposed girlfriend who or supposed child that supposedly he had from a previous girlfriend. You know, that I think is, you could have just completely scrapped. I think just have him be a detective, doesn't know anything about these people, but is trying to do his job to be a detective and figure out where the missing child is. He ultimately ends up discovering that he's the sacrifice, and he and some other women who are sympathetic to him try to escape the cult. And you see all of the supernatural and weird stuff that results from it, and you sort of see who lives, who dies, and whatnot, and you could play around with this. And I think, you know, had they had it in the supernatural, I think it would have created an interesting element to it, because um, it really would have made the whole cult a lot more threatening. Um, so I think, yeah, just those kinds of ideas, I think, would have suited this film a whole lot better. I mean, I think it's got some interesting things. It's just a mess, you know. You just look at it and go, these things they're not as executed in the way that you would think uh, a piece of art would be. You know, it's just it doesn't flow. There's hardly any real things that you can really connect with in the film. You know, it really doesn't jive as well as it wants it to. And I think had it had more direction and did the things that I suggested, it would have maintained its suspense, its horror, as well as its um, ability to capture the audience. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say about this film. However, if there are any questions, comments, concerns, I would be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care. Or, well, hopefully next year, because the next video that I'll be appearing in probably won't be till next year. But I wish the next minion luck, and goodbye.